I'm back again with yet another video exploring Metro Vancouver, and today we're delving deep into one of my favorite suburbs of Vancouver, and that is Port Moody. We're going to get into the pros and the cons of living in Port Moody. Let's not waste any more time and get into it right now. Hey friends, my name is Sebastian Albrecht with the Living in Vancouver BC team. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, thank you so much for stopping by. This channel is all about living in and moving to Vancouver. We put out videos just like this one every single week, and this week we're getting into the pros and the cons of living in Port Moody. And quite honestly, Port Moody really is one of my favorite parts of Metro Vancouver. It is such a gorgeous part of this region, and I'm really excited to share all the pros and the cons, because as wonderful as it is to live in Port Moody, there are some cons. And as always, I don't want to just sell you on the good side. Everything does have its positives and its negatives. So we're going to explore the good and the bad. But first, let's start with the positive. So pro number one is nature. And really, truly, Port Moody has nature right at your doorstep. It is phenomenal access to nature that really makes so many people love Port Moody. So right from the top, I'm going to talk about Sassamat Lake. It is one of the greatest little secrets, and these days with social media, it's not so secret anymore. But White Pine Beach is a phenomenal place to go in the summer months. I stopped by a few days ago. It was a beautiful summer's day, and it was just jam-packed with people enjoying the lake. And for me, being in Vancouver, it's a little bit unusual to be able to go to a freshwater lake in Metro Vancouver. Most of my time in the summers was always spent on the ocean, and the ocean can kind of be gritty and gross, and you feel dirty and grimy, but the lake is crisp, cool, clear, and it's just kind of tucked away. It is such a pristine location. Sassamat Lake and White Pine Beach in particular are a real secret hidden gem that you definitely want to explore, and you should take advantage of if you live in Port Moody. Then there's also Bunsen Lake. Now technically Bunsen Lake's not in Port Moody, but it is easily accessible from Port Moody. Unfortunately, Bunsen Lake requires you to, these days it's become so popular that you have to book parking ahead of time. And that's kind of an indication of just how popular things have gotten in Port Moody and the surrounding areas. There's a lot of people that sort of have moved into those communities in the last couple of years, but on top of that, there's also just a lot of people that converge on that area to access the outdoors and the nature that is so easily accessible for us from all parts of the Lower Mainland, but especially if you live in Port Moody. Then there's also Rocky Point Park, which is a little easier to access. It's a little more obvious. It's right on Burrard Inlet. I mean, we haven't talked about it too much, but Port Moody is right at the end of the Burrard Inlet, and Rocky Point Park is really that access that people in Port Moody have to the ocean. There's a boat launch there, there's a little beach, there's a huge grassy area, there's a park, there's a splash pad, there's some food to be had, and the breweries are not too far away either. So it's a great place to congregate on a beautiful summer's day, but it's also just a really nice place to go for a walk, whether it is super hot and sunny in the middle of the summer, or it's actually a rainy winter's day. All of nature around Port Moody is sort of pretty easily accessible, but Rocky Point Park is, even if it's snowing, obviously it's very low elevation. You're not going to risk an avalanche or something like that as you might if you're hiking in the backwoods. Speaking of hiking, there's really great hiking, and I'm just going to name a couple, but you know, Diaz Vistas Trail is one of the most obvious ones. Shoreline Trail, of course, around the end of Burrard Inlet as well, and the Burt Flynn Trail. But there's so much to explore around Port Moody, and that nature access is really one of the things that people love about living in Port Moody. Another big pro of living in Port Moody would be its location. So as mentioned, it's right at the end of Burrard Inlet. It's snuggled in between a few other larger municipalities. So to the north, you basically just have mountains. To the west, you have the ocean. To the south, I guess kind of to the southwest, you have Burnaby. To the east and to the south, you have Coquitlam. And so it's surrounded by these larger municipalities. Vancouver is not all that far away. And so its proximity and its access to downtown is one of the things that people really like about being in Port Moody. You get the access to all these bigger communities around you, but you're not in one. Especially with the SkyTrain now, there's 2 SkyTrain stops in Port Moody that make access out of Port Moody even better. So it becomes an even more inviting community because of its access to the surrounding areas. Nature, of course, as I spoke about already, is right at your doorstep and you're surrounded by nature, especially to the north. And then you have, of course, also, as I mentioned, really quick and easy access to Burnaby and to Coquitlam. Even on top of that, you also have, because you're not too far away from the highway, you have pretty easy access out into the Fraser Valley and further beyond that into the interior of BC. So it's much easier once you're in Port Moody to get out of the city, to get out of Metro Vancouver. That is much more challenging if you're in the city of Vancouver as an example, or even in Burnaby. So Port Moody offers you, I would say it's a pretty good balance for a lot of people. They find it's sort of the sweet spot in location. And honestly, that becomes a bit of the theme when we're talking about Port Moody. It is kind of that Goldilocks, like a really nice sort of in-between status between big urban center and small town community. And Port Moody offers so much of that, and its location contributes to that factor. Now, speaking of location, if you are thinking of moving to Vancouver and you're looking at purchasing a home, be sure to reach out anytime. As you may not already know, but you do now, I am a real estate agent that's helped hundreds of people move to Metro Vancouver. And I've helped them all find the right home. I can help you and your family as well. So reach out anytime. Whenever you're ready, I'm here for you and we can get that conversation started. Let's get back to the video. Another huge advantage, a big pro of living in Port Moody would be its transit access. And that transit access improved considerably in the last couple of years with the building of the Evergreen Line and the construction of 2 SkyTrain stations in Port Moody. And so that increases your ability to get around Metro Vancouver considerably. It's a much easier commute into downtown Vancouver. You can get over to Coquitlam, you could get down to Surrey if you wanted, you can get out to the airport pretty quickly. Port Moody's advantages have increased considerably with the access and the construction of the SkyTrain. On top of that, you also have the West Coast Express. Port Moody's stop is the last stop before you get into the city of Vancouver, before you get downtown. And it takes just 22 minutes to get from Port Moody Station into Vancouver, into the downtown core. And that's a really, really easy commute, because if you're commuting by car, it can be, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, can be miserable. There can be days where, despite the fact that you're not crossing a bridge, you are going to be stuck in traffic for a long period of time. But because you can access the West Coast Express and because you can also access the SkyTrain, you don't have to be relying on a vehicle and sort of get hit by the traffic mayhem that can happen. So huge advantage of being in Port Moody these days is its transit access. And I'm sorry, I should also mention, of course, the bus system. Buses aren't as frequent or as reliable as they're going to be in more centrally located areas, but of course there is also transit by bus that is possible in Port Moody. And then pro number 4 would be its small town feel. And that is one of the things that people really enjoy about Port Moody. It is only 40,000 people. And so you are just tucked in out of the way, unlike an area, let's say like New Westminster, which is also a smaller suburb of Vancouver. It feels much more urban and much busier because New Westminster is kind of at the crossroads of a number of different municipalities. As people need to get from, let's say, Surrey into Vancouver or from Coquitlam down to Tsawwassen, many of them cross through New Westminster. Port Moody doesn't have that happening. And as a result, it feels much smaller. There's only 40,000 people there. The feedback I get from people who have moved there, or my own experience being there, is people are a little friendlier, a little more readily willing to help, to smile at you as you pass them by on the street and to say hello. Streets feel safer. You're not going to see as many homeless. There's not as much sort of evidence of drug addiction and mental illness, and more specifically, sort of the homelessness that you might see in other parts of Metro Vancouver. It at least feels much more family oriented. And there are a lot of families that live in Port Moody and find it sort of this really strong balance, as I'm going to talk about in the next pro, between urban and small town, and kind of that perfect location for a family to settle in. So a lot of people are drawn to Port Moody because of that small town feel. And that's what you're gonna love about it. That is, if you are looking for a small town feel, that is something you are definitely gonna love about Port Moody. And it's actually kind of hard to find around Metro Vancouver. So this is one of the more unique destinations if that is something that appeals to you. And pro number 5, as I touched on in the last one, was it's balance. It's balance between urban and small town. It's balance between urban and nature as well. For a lot of people, Port Moody becomes that perfect in between, that you don't need to live in the giant city of Vancouver or Coquitlam or Burnaby or whatever it is in relation to Port Moody. You can live in a much smaller community, enjoy all the benefits of that small community, but also get all of the benefits of being close to much larger urban centers. And so you can still live in Port Moody and commute pretty easily via the West Coast Express, 22 minutes into downtown Vancouver, and go to work to your office job in downtown Vancouver. You can also just head out for a night on the town, go catch a Canucks game, watch the Men's World Cup that's coming in 2026 in downtown Vancouver from living in Port Moody. You're not so far removed that that's not possible. But then you can also just venture out into the mountains and you can go up and hike. Some of my favorite hikes are around Port Moody and get completely into the wilderness very, very quickly. But also into other parts of Metro Vancouver. Let's not just focus exclusively on the city of Vancouver, but there's lots of other really beautiful parts of Vancouver that offer a lot that you can access very easily from Port Moody. And so people really are drawn to Port Moody because they enjoy that balance between urban and small town and urban and nature. And Port Moody, for a lot of people, finds that perfect balance, and it might for you as well. So now let's get into the cons. And as much as Port Moody is such an ideal place to live, there are some cons, but quite honestly, it was challenging for me to come up with 5 cons about Port Moody. It's tough to think of things that are wrong with living in Port Moody, but number one is probably one that I didn't have a hard time with, and that would be the traffic. Traffic in rush hour can be horrendous in Port Moody, and that's because there's only a couple sort of ways in and out of Port Moody. You know, the traffic really does pile up. So specifically on the Barnett Highway and on Ioko Road, those are real bottlenecks that you're gonna have some challenges with through rush hour traffic. And so a commute into, as an example, into downtown Vancouver, if you're using your vehicle and traveling alone, it could be around 30 minutes. Maybe it's 35 minutes to drive into downtown Vancouver on a good day from Port Moody. But on a bad day, that could actually take 1.5 hours. And to give you an example, my son was playing lacrosse this last season. And so we were playing games all throughout Metro Vancouver. And so driving, I had this experience where it actually took me longer to get from our house in the center of the city of Vancouver to the center of Port Moody. It took longer to get there, about 1 hour and 45 minutes, than it did for us to drive from the center of Vancouver at the same time of day to Chilliwack. And Chilliwack is way further. And it kind of blew my mind about how challenging it can be to drive from one side of Metro Vancouver to another. Now, part of that reason is we don't have that ring road system. We don't have that highway system that makes it efficient to drive through the city. And all cities, all municipalities in Metro Vancouver are trying to encourage you not to drive. They want to make that a little more challenging, but then try and get you to take transit specifically, or maybe an Uber or cycle. But in this case, probably taking a SkyTrain would have been a much more efficient way for us to get there. And it really would have been. It would have taken maybe half an hour to get from roughly where I am in Vancouver to where we needed to go in Port Moody. So in hindsight, that's what I should have done. But the experience of driving and the traffic can really get tightly congested. And if you live up in Heritage Woods and you want to get down in the middle of winter, that can be a real hassle too. Not just because of the traffic you're going to get on Ioko Road, but also because the steepness of the access, getting down the hill, and not everybody's going to be prepared. It gets slippery, it gets slidey, and that can be a real disaster. So traffic can be a problem in Port Moody. But hey, to be honest, like, this is one of the cons that I find I could pick out of just about anywhere. And it's not really exclusive to Port Moody, and there are ways to avoid it, like taking the SkyTrain as an example. Con number 2 of living in Port Moody would be the weather. Now, I've talked about the weather a lot in Metro Vancouver, and I've tried to express how diverse it can be. One part of Vancouver is not like another part of Vancouver. In general, we get this reputation as being wet and rainy, maybe dark and cloudy as well. But that's not really the truth in every part of Metro Vancouver. Port Moody, that reputation is well deserved. So in Port Moody, you're getting almost double the amount of rain as you are in some of the lesser areas of rain in Metro Vancouver. In Port Moody, you get about 2,000 millimeters of rain every single year. The city of Vancouver gets closer to 1,100 millimeters, so considerably less. One of the areas that gets the least in Metro Vancouver is the city of Tsawwassen. and Tawasin gets about 900 millimeters. So if you're comfortable with a little more rain, that is what you're going to find in Port Moody. And again, I've spoken about this in other videos, but I just want to make clear that you understand why this happens in the areas around Port Moody. And specifically, it's the mountains to the north of Port Moody and also to the north of North Vancouver. Essentially, what are the North Shore Mountains block the clouds as they come off of the Pacific Ocean. They're heavy with precipitation that they've picked up over the ocean, and they're trying to rise up over the mountains. So they get socked in there. The cloud cover can be pretty dense in the Port Moody area. So you're also going to find that it's a bit darker. And then in order for those clouds to lift over the mountains, they have to dump the rain, and they're dropping it on Port Moody, unfortunately. The result is, I mean, a lot of natural beauty, lots of greenery, a lot of water, and especially in the winter months, that's where you see the most of it. And of course, because it's winter, it's going to be cold, and it's more likely that you're going to get snow, especially in the higher elevations in Port Moody. So Port Moody, sort of Heritage Mountain, kind of Heritage Woods area, gets a considerable amount of snow because you're higher elevation and you're in an area that gets more precipitation. But you're going to get more snow there than you're going to get in Tawasin or in White Rock, as an example, or even the city of Vancouver. So something to be aware of. And it's true of my own experience. Just a little while ago, I did a video comparing a number of different suburbs and sort of growing suburbs in Metro Vancouver, and I was running around doing some B-roll shooting. When I was in Port Moody taking some B-roll shots, it was raining, and I could see off in the distance to the south towards Tawasin, where it's always sunny, always seemingly to be sunny. There indeed was sort of brightness in the clouds in that direction. And by the time I drove out to Tawasin, sure enough, it was actually sunny. It was winter, so or it was early spring, I think, so it wasn't super warm, but there was sunlight, no rain. And in Port Moody, it was rainy and cloudy. So that is definitely the experience you're going to have when living in Port Moody. And, you know, to be frank, maybe it's not a negative for you. Maybe you're coming from Phoenix, Arizona, and you want to be in a place that has precipitation. You want to be in a wetter place. Well, Port Moody is definitely that location. But if you're looking for a dry spot in Metro Vancouver, it is not Port Moody. So when I was thinking of the cons of living in Port Moody, I was having a hard time. I came up with 3 pretty quickly. I'm going to save the third one, probably the biggest one, for the very end. But I have 2 that are relative fillers. You know, I had to really stretch it to find 2 more cons of living in Port Moody because honestly, it's such a great place to be living. But these are things that you really do need to pay attention to. And if you're moving here from somewhere else, you are going to be surprised and shocked by these things. You may not get this information anywhere else. So con number 3 that I want to touch on is the train noise. And it has an industrial area, it has an industrial zone. It was meant to be the terminus of the Trans-Canada Railway originally. And at the last minute, they moved it over to Vancouver because they discovered, or this is what they said, and fair enough, it is true, that the end of Burrard Inlet wasn't a deep enough harbor that they needed. So they couldn't rely on that. And true enough, today, the end of Burrard Inlet around Port Moody is pretty muddy. It's a muddy flat because of silt that comes down from the mountains. So it was a good choice not to center the end of the railway right there on Port Moody. But the result is that the railway runs right through Port Moody, and on the southern end of Port Moody, you not only have the Trans-Canada Railway coming through there heading to the Port of Vancouver, but you also have the SkyTrain and you also have the West Coast Express. And so you have very active rail lines running right through Port Moody. And there was a time the trains honked their horns coming through Port Moody as well. My understanding today is that while the train tracks are very active, and perhaps more so, especially because of the SkyTrain and because of the West Coast Express, what you don't have any longer are the horns honking going through Port Moody. But some of the more appealing areas of Port Moody are actually right on the rail lines. And so it is an important thing to a consideration as you're thinking about where you're going to live and how that might impact you. Be aware of where those rail lines are. You may not care. You might love trains. You might love to stare right at a train as it passes right by you, but you might also be super sensitive to noise. And that might be something, you know, you might be looking at where the streets are, but not be aware of just how busy the rail lines can be in Port Moody. That is definitely a potential con of living in Port Moody. And con number 4, again, a bit of a stretch, But bear with me, it's the lake access. Now, if you're looking at a map, what you see is that Port Moody is right at the end of Burrard Inlet, which is the ocean. It's the access for Metro Vancouver to the open ocean. You would think, looking at the map, that Port Moody would really orient itself to the ocean. But the reality is it has very limited access to the ocean. There are some rocky outcroppings around Port Moody and then some real muddy flats and terrain. There are a couple beaches, but nothing like what you're going to find in the city of Vancouver or in West Vancouver or in Tsawwassen, especially not Tsawwassen, where you have Crescent Beach. In comparison to what you get in many of the other ocean-oriented parts of Metro Vancouver, I would say that that's a limitation of Port Moody. It has a beach, a decent beach at Rocky Point Park. There's a couple on the northern side of Burrard Inlet, but very, very little, and very rocky, also very muddy at the very end of Burrard Inlet. But what Port Moody does have is the lake access. And I think that's a pretty fair trade-off, because the lake access, especially Sassamat Lake, but Bunsen Lake as well, which, as I mentioned, isn't technically in Port Moody, but is easily accessible from Port Moody. The people in Port Moody, when they're looking for a place to go to the water, they really generally head up to Sassamat Lake or to Bunsen Lake, and the people in surrounding communities as well. And that is a phenomenal asset, but it is important to recognize your access to the ocean is relatively limited. I should point out, aside from the beach at Rocky Point Park, there's also a boat launch. So if you do have a seagoing vessel, if you want to get out on your sailboat or whatever it happens to be, there is the ability to launch it from Rocky Point Park as well. But keep in mind, the access to the ocean is very different than other parts of the Metro Vancouver that are much more ocean oriented. All right, so con number 5 is the big one, and that's the cost of housing. And I think, we can pretty much say this is the case with anywhere in Metro Vancouver. So take this with a grain of salt, but Port Moody is not an inexpensive place to live, just like anywhere else in Metro Vancouver. However, we are going to note that it is relatively inexpensive in terms of its relation to the city of Vancouver. So for me, it is one of those areas that is offering a lot, and it's relatively close. And you are getting, in many instances, a pretty good discount to be living outside of Vancouver. And that's why it might become an appealing consideration for you if you're thinking of moving to Vancouver. But let's get into it. The cost of owning first, and then I'm going to get into the cost of renting. But in terms of ownership, for a house, a typical house in Port Moody in July of 2024 is $2,182,800. That's versus, in comparison, in the city of Vancouver, $2,688,800. The difference is 23%. So you're saving just shy of a quarter of the cost of housing if you're looking at purchasing a house in Port Moody versus one in Vancouver. In terms of townhouses, a typical townhouse in Port Moody in July of 2024 is $1,048,300 versus $1,355,000 in Vancouver. And that is a very significant difference of 29%. So over a quarter and almost a third is what you're going to save by moving to Port Moody rather than living in Vancouver. And so if you're in that budget, if you're looking at about $1 million for something that a family could live in, most likely that's going to be a 3-bedroom townhouse. And most likely it's also going to be up on Heritage Woods, Heritage Mountain sort of area. That's a great place to live and find an affordable townhouse. Something to consider if you're looking at moving to Port Moody. And then we are looking at condos, and condos, the difference is much closer. $760,100 for a condo in Port Moody and $811,500 in Vancouver. So that is only a difference of 7%. It's a pretty close gap there. And in my mind, if you're in that budget, if you're looking at either a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom condo, you're not actually saving a lot by moving out to Port Moody. What you are going to get is probably something that's a little bit newer and a little closer to the center of Port Moody than what you might find that your budget is going to be able to afford you in Vancouver. But that saving is going to be pretty slim, and that's where it's going to be a harder decision for you. Is it worth it to move outside of the city or not? And what I'm finding more and more is that the cost of buying condos is fairly similar, whether you're looking at Vancouver, Burnaby, Coquitlam, Port Moody. These numbers are all kind of right around the same ballpark. Not as big a gap as if you're looking at townhouses and houses. Now, let's look at what rents are like. And rents, once again, are going to be less expensive in Port Moody. There's no surprise there. But just How much less expensive? Let's look at that. In the case of one bedrooms, you're looking at $2,412 for a typical one bedroom rental in Port Moody in July of 2024. In the case of Vancouver, it's $2,700. So $2,695 to be exact. So that's roughly a 15% difference. Not an insignificant amount. In the case of a two-bedroom rental, it's $3,200 for a two-bedroom in Port Moody, and it's $3,800 in Vancouver. And there you're getting, that's $600, a substantial difference. And again, something in the range of about 15%. And then three bedrooms, I think, is where you're seeing a little more of a gap. In Port Moody, it's $3,578, and in Vancouver, it's $4,890. So basically $3,500 in Port Moody and about $5,000 in Vancouver. And that's where the gap gets a little more serious. And again, I think it's an indication of the smaller properties, what are more likely to be condos, are priced very similarly to the inner city, the inner part of Metro Vancouver, Vancouver itself. Whereas the larger properties, that's where you're gonna find the most savings if you're moving out to Port Moody. And that's also why it becomes much more appealing to families who need that kind of space. And they get shocked a little bit about what those costs might be in Vancouver. And they're starting to look for a little more affordability, and you are gonna find that in Port Moody. So as we can see, there's so many pros and a few cons of living in Port Moody. As I said, Port Moody truly is one of my favorite parts of Metro Vancouver. I love to visit. I've considered moving there in the past. Now that I'm settled in Vancouver, I'm not really thinking that any longer, but maybe one day when I retire, Port Moody will become a little more of a possibility for me and my family. Perhaps it's a possibility for you. If you're thinking of moving to Vancouver and you're thinking of buying a home, don't forget that I am a real estate agent that's helped hundreds of families just like yours settle in Vancouver. And I can help you and your family decide what is the right fit, not just in terms of location, but in terms of housing as well. All it takes is a phone call and we can get that conversation started. But also, I have so much information here just for you. I've made countless videos. I'm plus in the 70 plus range of videos at this point, all about living in and moving to Metro Vancouver. You're gonna wanna explore those videos. But if you like this one, be sure to hit the like button and smash the subscribe button if you wanna see more videos just like this one, all about living in and moving to Vancouver. I do have a couple very specific videos I think you're gonna wanna watch. This one over here is all about the pros and the cons of living in Burnaby. And then this one is the most recent video I did all about the costs of living in Burnaby. And those are gonna be very similar to Port Moody. Those are things you're gonna want to explore. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you on next week's video as well.